Thank you to everyone who decided to tune into the webinar today. Your hosts for this presentation are myself, Christy Dice, and Martha Sullins, and we're both with CSU Extension. We thought this would be a good webinar to kick off the growing season this year. As we all know, growing produce outside presents a lot of risks that many times are out of our control, but there are some areas where farmers can focus their efforts to reduce some of those risks. Our webinar today will help you identify the potential risks that are in and around your fields and strategies to help mitigate those risks. This webinar series is part of an educational series offered by the Colorado Produce Safety Collaborative. The collaborative is made up of 5 organizations that have come together to coordinate produce safety education efforts to provide more resources and education opportunities to fruit and vegetable growers around the state. The members of the collaborative are Colorado State University Extension, Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, Fort Lewis College, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, and the Colorado Department of Agriculture. This educator group offers Produce Safety Alliance grower training, workshops on how to develop a farm food safety plan, webinars on risk management, and other classes to help growers with produce safety rule compliance and developing good agricultural practices. Our speaker today is Sergio Nieto Montenegro. Sergio earned his PhD degree in food science from Penn State University, and he worked 3 years at Clemson University. He currently runs the company Food Safety CTS LLC. Sergio is a specialist in developing and implementing food safety and training programs for the industry. The company specializes in translating science and technology into everyone's language. Food Safety CTS LLC has developed industry-wide tailored food safety training programs for the American Mushroom Institute, Arizona and California Leafy Greens Marketing Association, and the National Mango Board, among others. In the last 3 years, the company has conducted FSMA-related projects in 18 countries in the Americas. Some logistics for our webinar. Our presentation today will be 1 hour presentation and then 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. Please enter your questions in the chat box. We will wait until the end to answer them to allow Sergio time to get through all of his material. We may address a couple of them in the middle of the webinar, but Martha Sullins is going to be managing that chat box, and so she'll add those questions in as we need them. The chat box is located at the bottom of the webinar, which can be found by hovering over the bottom of the Zoom window. Click on the icon that says chat, and a dialog box will appear at the side of the screen where you can enter your questions. We are recording this webinar, and we will post it on our website, www.coproducesafety.org. If you have any questions about produce safety, Martha and myself are always available as resources for you all, so do not hesitate to reach out to either one of us. We also really like to hear from our farmers on what resources you need in relation to food safety. So please let us know if there's a topic you would like to have more information on or a potential webinar we could host. And just one more reminder for everybody, please visit our website for resources related to produce safety. If you do not find what you need, you can reach out to us and we can help you. Many times our growers indicate that they need more information or resources, but they don't know where to find them. And we usually end up having those on our website, so please go there often and check out what we have available for you. We're going to get started with our presentation now. I'm going to post a link in the chat box that takes you to a file that's part of a training workbook that the Arizona LGMA uses for its growers, and that will support our presentation today by Sergio. All right, Sergio, you can go ahead and share your screen, and I will post the link for the workbook.
Thank you. I think you need to stop sharing your screen.
I did.
There you go. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christy. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sergio Nieto Montenegro. And as Christy said, I work for Food Safety CTS. What are we going to learn today? Today, we're going to learn about a very important practice that we must or should do in our fields, which is how to conduct an environmental assessment. Some people call it risk assessment. I like to call it an environmental assessment. So let me share my screen and get started on this. But before I share my screen, I'd like to ask a question. If you guys can answer on the chat box, and tell me what type of products do you grow? What type of products do you grow? So you can start typing on the chat. Okay, red, yellow, and white onions. What else? Just onions? Anyone else? The reason that I'm asking these questions is so I can customize a little bit I can customize a little bit the presentation. There's no farms that are the same. There's no two farms that are the same. It's not the same to have grapes than to have onions, than to have watermelons, than to have cantaloupes, than tomatoes, than berries, apples. Okay.
Sergio, I think a lot of our participants might be allied industry as well. So
what's that?
That might be part. I think a lot of our participants might be allied industries. That might be why a lot of people aren't putting information in the chat.
Okay, so let's move on. I see. We have a lot of people from the Colorado Department of Agriculture. Nice, good to have you. So this presentation is based on some of the requirements of the Arizona Leafy Greens LGMA metrics. So as I say, I'm gonna get started and teaching you some basic concepts on what is an environmental assessment, how to conduct an environmental assessment, the important sections that a checklist has, how to document an environmental assessment. The first thing that we need to understand is what is an environmental assessment. All the fields where we grow our fresh produce need to be periodically monitored. And what is this? We need to visually inspect the fields. The monitoring requires visual observation of field conditions, focusing on finding potential physical, chemical, and biological contaminants. In the assessment or monitoring or inspection, whatever you're gonna call it, you're gonna be looking for different risks, for different things that may pose a risk to the produce that we grow. In other words, you're gonna do a visual monitoring of your field, looking for physical, chemical, and biological hazards that may contaminate the produce that you grow. That is an environmental assessment. It's a visual monitoring of the field. As I say, some people call it assessment, some people call it inspections, some people call it just walk the field. But it's not only about just walking the field. It is important to document your environmental assessment. Here in this webinar, I'm gonna talk about two different types of assessment. The pre-harvest assessment that takes place within 1 week prior to harvesting, and the daily harvest assessment that takes place on the harvesting day, the day that you're gonna harvest your crop. There's another type of assessment that it's called pre-planting assessment. And that's the assessment that you do. That's the assessment that you conduct before planting a field. Before you're gonna plant your onions or your cantaloupes, you are going to walk that field. You're going to visual monitor that field to see what's around that field that may pose a risk to the field. Think about this. Just transport yourself from your house or your office or wherever you are to one of the ranches that you visit. to one of the farms that you visit. It's not the same a farm that it's in the middle of nowhere than a farm that it's next to an urban settlement. It's not the same a farm in the middle of nowhere than a farm that it's next to a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation. It's not the same a farm in the middle of nowhere than a farm next to the river. It's not the same, and I can go on and on and on with different examples. The risks are gonna be different. And what is a tool that we can use to identify the potential contamination risk to my products? That is an assessment, an environmental assessment, which is a visual monitoring of the field. As I say, that monitoring of the field must be documented. I'm gonna try not to mention the LGMA requirements. But one requirement in the LGMA metrics and in most of the third-party private audits includes documenting of your environmental assessments, documenting of your inspection, the visual monitoring of the field. And we generally use a checklist. Forms, logs, and checklists are simple and easy to use documents that ensure that a specific food safety tasks are completed and a specific information is collected. You can use a checklist to document your environmental assessment. And that checklist is gonna have different areas. There are so many different types of checklists, but they look pretty much, they look similar. Each company developed their checklist based on their needs. I like to say that you can divide your checklist in 3 different sections. The general information section, which is where you're gonna, that's where you're gonna write down the harvesting company name or the ranch name, the farm name, the name of the people who is, the name of the person who is conducting the assessment, the crew who is harvesting that at that specific day, the ranch, the lot, the date of the assessment, all the general information that it's gonna help me to identify the specific ranch or farm where I conducted the assessment. Then we have another area that it's probably the most important area, which is the area where you document the different risks. It's the evaluation of the potential contamination risks. And then depending on your farm, you're gonna have the different things that you're gonna be looking at. For instance, this farm has a checklist, so they look for animal intrusion, harvest equipment, product containers, sanitary operation of equipment, worker practices, toilet and hand washing facilities, concentrations of the different chemical products that they use. And then the third section of the checklist includes corrective actions. What are corrective actions? Corrective actions are the actions that you apply in your field when a deviation occurs. We are in agriculture and things are going to happen. And we're gonna have, I mean, it's very difficult. Let me give you an example. If we're talking about animal intrusion, the animals are gonna walk into your field. No matter what you do, you're gonna have animals in your field. And the problem is not to have that animal in your field. The problem is when you have an animal and don't do anything, when you do nothing. You're gonna have a leak in your hand washing station or in your portable restroom every now and then. The problem is not having that. The problem is when you do nothing to fix that. And each corrective action must be documented. That is a very important best practice. So to summarize what's on a checklist for conducting the visual monitoring of your field. You have the general information. The general information includes the name of the person completing the inspection, the date of the inspection, the ranch and the lot, the harvesting crew, ID or number, and then a place to verify or that the checklist was completed. And then you have another area that it's going to help you to identify the different risk, the evaluation of potential contamination risk. And this is the core of the environmental assessment. And then you have a third area to document any corrective actions. A hint or a tip. It is really important to teach the supervisors and the foremen who work in the field that things are going to happen, and that they need to document how they fix things, how they apply a corrective action. Here we have another example of another checklist. I like checklists to be really easy to use for the people who work for me, for the people who work at the university, at the Colorado Department of Agriculture. For us, managing paperwork, it's an easy task. But think about the guy who is in the field, the supervisor. He needs to take care of people. He needs to grow product. He needs to take care of the sanitizer concentration. Plus, he needs to fill the paperwork. So it is really important to have a very simple but effective checklist that looks at the different risks that might happen in my field. So the way that we design a checklist, it's gonna be, the easier we design a checklist, the better it's gonna be filled by the supervisor. And we also need to train the supervisors and foremen in the field that this is the footprint of what happened in the field at one specific point in time. If we want to know what happened in my cantaloupe field on July the 5th of 2019, well, I can go back and look at the checklist that I have. So that's why it's really important to design a very nice and effective checklist to conduct the environmental assessment of the field. Like, how do I know if I'm having trouble with animals in my field? One day, every other day, I have animal intrusion in my field. Who's gonna tell me that? Well, my checklist, the checklist that I fill for conducting my environmental assessment. So at this point, I think I have covered three very important things. What is an environmental assessment, which is a visual monitoring of the field, looking for different potential hazards, physical, chemical, and biological. That there are many different types of environmental assessments: the pre-planting environmental assessment, the pre-harvest assessment, which takes place within 1 week prior to harvesting, and the daily harvest assessment, which takes place on the harvesting day. And then I also cover what's on a checklist for conducting an environmental assessment. And then I cover the different areas that a checklist has: the general information, the evaluation of potential contamination risks, and the corrective actions. I like to say that there are pretty much three important areas in my checklist. And this is the core. Whatever I have here in the computer screen is the core of my presentation. I'm gonna go over each one of the different potential contamination risks, and I'm gonna be telling you guys what to look for during an environmental assessment. So let's get started. Let me look at my clock. Let me look at, oh, we're doing good on time. It's challenging talking to a screen. As you can tell, I like using my hands. So it's kind of interesting. But we are all getting used to this and making the best out of it. Okay, so the first area that I want to take a look at, the first area that I want to take a look at, it's the field sanitary facilities. The field sanitary facilities include my portable toilet units and my hand washing stations. And so the company, my have an SOP, an standard operating procedure, to manage the sanitary facilities and the hand washing stations. We need to take a look at different areas in my field sanitary program to make sure that things are working properly. Now, per the produce safety rule, we need to have some field sanitary facilities. But how do I make sure that these are working? Conducting an environmental assessment, doing a visual monitoring of this. What do I need to look for? Well, I need to make sure that the location of the units minimize the impact of potential leaks or spills, while still allowing access to my employees and having access for cleaning and sanitizing them, and also to service them. So the location is important. When I'm doing my environmental assessment, I need to check where my portable units are located. The number of facilities per OSHA, I need to have 1 facility per 20 employees. Cleanliness and adequate supplies. It's not only about having a portable toilet facility, it needs to be clean. And clean, it's not the same as serviced. So the facility needs to be clean and needs to be serviced regularly. How can I make sure that it's clean? Well, I need to go and check it. I need to go and open the door, make sure that it has all the adequate supplies, that has the toilet paper, that has some posters reminding people to wash their hands after using the restroom, making sure that they are clean and that they have been serviced, that there's soap. And it's not only about, they are there. They are 200 feet from here. No, I gotta go, get out from my truck and go and check them when I'm doing my assessment. That's the whole point of the assessment. Look for facility signs that it has like posters for reminding people to wash their hands, about the proper hand washing procedure. Remember, here, I'm not talking about the produce safety rule. I'm talking about the things that people in the Arizona LGMA metrics require companies to do. But it's a collection of best practices that we can all learn and that we can all adapt to implement in my facility. The requirements in some third-party private standards are also covered in these type of things that we're looking at here, without being specific. I'm trying to be as general as possible. As I say, we need to make sure that the facility has been daily clean and serviced, that they have been maintained, and that we have a response plan for major leaks or spills. I've seen portable units like going down, and that's a challenge. Some companies have a plan in place. What am I gonna do if something like that happens? I'm probably gonna call the company that provides the facilities, and they will take care of that. But then I might have in my SOP that I need to have a buffered no harvest zone, a buffer zone, so I don't harvest product near of the leak or spill. I need to do a thorough inspection to make sure that my product hasn't been or hasn't been contaminated. Another important areas that I need to look when I'm doing my environmental assessment, especially the daily assessment, make sure that my employees come clean to work. Look at the employee health and hygiene practices. The employees must come to work clean and wearing clean work clothes, that they wash their hands properly. It's not only about having the facility. I have to make sure that they wash their hands before they step into the field, that they remove the jewelry and other objects, that the breaks, that they take place not on the field, that they take place at a designated area, that they are wearing their protective equipment appropriately. If my company decides that they are gonna wear gloves, arm sleeves, an apron, that everyone wears that. And if there's a break, that they place that at a designated area. That the tools that they use, that they are properly used. If I have a policy for cleaning and sanitizing the harvesting knives, well, that if I have a policy that after each break, they need to go and place that on a bucket, well, we need to make sure that things happen, that is happening in the field. Blood, that people don't get in the field with cuts. How do I find out about that? During my daily pre-harvest environmental assessment. And that's probably the supervisor's work. I also, during the environmental assessment, I need to look at the condition of water source and distribution. The conditions of the water source and distribution system must be checked thoroughly in the environmental assessment. At a minimum, you must make sure to check the following: that the water source is in acceptable conditions, that all the tanks that I use are clean, that all the hoses are off the ground, that if I'm using chlorinated water, treated water, that the tanks are marked. Little things here and there. I like to say that food safety is not rocket science. It's paying attention to the details, but we have so many details that we need to look at. And we need to train our employees. It's not just about getting a webinar. We need to train the employees on how to do all these things. Get out of the truck, get out of the bus, get the checklist, walk the field with the checklist. If they are checking the portable units, the portable restroom units, that they gotta go and open the door of each one of these units. And after they verify that the unit has all the supplies, they are gonna check the checklist that we talk about. That's the whole point of the environmental assessments. That all the pipes and pumps are well maintained and are working properly, that the water sources are free of trash, debris, and animal hazards. No potential contamination risk from reservoirs, canals, or any other open water sources. What am I gonna do if I'm about to irrigate? Think about the assessment. Think about the assessment that you do. Think about the assessment that you do, the pre-harvest assessment, the one that it's done within 1 week prior to harvesting. And then you are going to irrigate. And then you find dead animals in the canal that you're using. Well, the dead animal is there. What are you gonna do? Well, you need to do a corrective action according to your company's procedure. But how are you gonna find that you have that issue? To the environmental assessment. Walking the canals. And I'm not talking about walking the whole canal, like 50 miles. No, walk whatever is within your control. There's only so much things that we can do, and we need to be practical, but we need to be really, really thorough. We need to look at things, we need to look at so many details, different details. If you have reservoirs, check for animal hazards, contaminated waters, the cleanliness of the reservoir, vegetation, the surface water distance from hazards. If I have a reservoir, how far is my reservoir from a dairy barn? Is my reservoir uphill or downhill from cattle? Like things like that. How am I gonna find that out? Through the visual monitoring of the field. If you can tell, I keep repeating that. Why is that? Because we need to walk the field, walk the field. Here in this presentation, we have some, these are all recommendations. The metrics change a little bit on how you can, if you have a water source and then you have a metric from a specific risk, how far your water source must be from that specific risk. And you can look at that on your own. If we have if my water source is a well, I need to look at the casing of the well. I need to look at the casing during the casing of the well during my environmental assessment. Look at the well cap or seal, the bend, the concrete well path, the well pump, if it's clean, if there's no vegetation around my well. There are so many different things that we can look during my environmental assessment. And it's a good practice to look at the different areas, at the different risks, so we can try to minimize them. Where's my well? Is it uphill? If it's downhill? If I have runoff of water, if I have my well cap here, does the water gonna go to my well? Is there gonna be filtration to my water, to the water in my well? All these little things are really important. Look at the different mechanical components in my irrigation and distribution systems, the water lines. It is impossible to walk the entire field, but we need to walk the field, not the whole thing, but maybe try to do Z patterns. Try to look, if I don't have, let's say, if I have drip irrigation and the water doesn't contact the harvestable part of my crop, of my produce. Well, when you're doing your assessment, look at your water distribution system to make sure that there's no leaks, that there are no that there are no leaks, that it's not broken, that you don't have like spills or leaks that are gonna make that water touches my product. And how can I be aware of that? During my environmental assessments. Also look at the different water tanks, containers, and equipment that you're using in your facility. Look at the pipes, look at the tanks. Do not oversee the tanks. They also need to be clean and sanitized. Any questions up to here? Feel free to ask questions on the chat box. Any questions? Are we doing okay? Let's move to
questions so far. Sergio, could I ask you one quick question?
Sure.
Just a quick one. I was wondering, you mentioned patterns for walking the field. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. I've heard some discussion about sampling and trying to mix up patterns if you're doing field sampling. What about those observations? What do you recommend for growers who are trying to capture as much information about what's going on in the field without like always walking the same way, or so that they are able to make a variety of observations?
That's a great question. There's no, your fields. Like look at these fields. Look at these fields. Probably where we are. Let me see if I can find another picture. Look at this field. This field is in the middle of nowhere. Can you tell? Like, look at this field. Look at this field. This field is also in the middle of nowhere, but this one you can see urban settings like near the field. Look at this other one. You have some trees on the other side of the field. This is a little bit different than the patterns that you use for sampling in your field. People say, like a grower told me, I just use common sense. I just do like a C, or I just say I'm gonna walk every other line, or I'm gonna walk just the perimeter. I know this field doesn't give me a lot of trouble, So I'm just, my walk, it's gonna be like a big Z. Or I'm just gonna walk the area that I'm gonna harvest. In other words, there's no answer for that because there are no two fields that are the same. If my field is near the Colorado River, like in Yuma, Arizona, well, I'm gonna go and look for stuff in the adjacent areas of the field that are near the Colorado River. Does that make sense? So there's not a formula to walk the field. That's the short answer. Use the common sense and think about your risks. If I'm just gonna walk, if I'm just gonna harvest 3 acres, well, try to walk these 3 acres or 4 acres. And you might use like a C pattern, or you might walk like every other line. Or if you see animal tracks, follow the animal tracks. Sorry, I don't have an answer like this is the way of doing it.
Thank you, Sergio. That was perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, floating. What is floating? Floating is the flowing or overflowing of a field with water beyond a producer's control that can contain disease-causing microorganisms. I think this is really important. Why? Because the FDA considers leafy green, considers produce in contact with floating waters to be adulterated. So if there's a flooding event in your area, and the flooding and the water coming from the flood touches your product, the FDA considers that product to be adulterated. Flooding is the flowing or overflowing of a field with water beyond a producer's control that can contain disease-causing microorganisms. As I say, if your produce gets in touch with water from a flooding event, that produce is considered to be adulterated and cannot enter the market. Some recommendations for a flooding event. It is important to have an SOP that helps assessing a flooded field. If you spot a flooded field that it's about to be harvested, you should follow your SOPs. Let me tell you a little bit about what others do. Some farms consider, like in the LGMA, 30 feet. If you have a flooding event, you're gonna have, or you're gonna establish, now you can see me because I can see I can do the 30 feet. Let's suppose that the field, that the floating event starts here. So they establish a no harvest area, no harvest zone of 30 feet. And then they start harvesting from here to there. And that can change a little bit if the floating area is here and then your field is here. Or they can decrease the 30 feet if it's the other way around. You also need to be aware of the food contact surfaces. If you are using harvesting equipment and the harvesting equipment touches water from a flooded area, you need to clean and sanitize that equipment. If your equipment touches the soil who has been flooded, you need to clean and sanitize. That piece of equipment. Here's another area that we're gonna cover in the environmental assessment, which is probably one of the most important ones and one of the most challenging ones, which is animal nutrition. Wild animals, livestock, or domestic animals can be carriers of disease-causing microorganisms. all the farms, all the fields are susceptible to animal intrusions because produce is generally grown in areas that might have adjacent wetlands, wildlands, or parks harboring wildlife. Any type of animal in the field may lead to crop contamination, posing a significant risk to produce since contamination can happen through physical contact to fecal matter. There's something about animals in the field. When we think that there's no way that we can avoid animals entering our fields. Do you agree with what I just said? And that's a question. Anyone agrees with what I just said? There's no way that we can avoid the entrance of animals into our fields. Even if we have a wall, if we have a fence, animals are gonna find a way to enter my field. And they can spread disease-causing microorganisms through their feces. But also, just because we found animal tracks doesn't mean that all the field is contaminated. So we need to decide what is a low hazard animal intrusion and what is a high hazard animal intrusion that represents a higher risk. As I say, there's no way that we can avoid animal entrance into our fields. Yes, and they are an indicator of biodiversity on the plus side, of course, but a headache on the food safety side. Yes, I agree with what you say. Let me give you a story, a quick story. In Costa Rica, like they found a monkey, just like it was a banana plantation, and a monkey like jumped into the field. If you go to Arizona, you're gonna find coyotes. Chipmunks in some of their areas, snakes, reptiles. But the hazard is different. Think about your crop. If you are growing produce in a tree, your risk is different than growing produce like onions or cantaloupes, or the risks are just different. Think about a dog. Think about a dog in an apple farm. Think about a dog in an avocado farm. Think about a dog in a mango farm. The risk is very different than a dog on a leafy greens farm. So we need to learn, or we need to have a mindset that animals in the field are gonna be there. And that the thing that we need to learn, and that we want our employees to learn, is to identify the hazard. First, to identify if there's a likelihood of animal intrusion. Number two, to make sure that we are doing our environmental assessments the right way. That means walking the field. And that we identify what is something that it's called a low hazard or negligible risk, or medium high hazard probable risk. If it's not the same finding one piece of poop than having an infested field. And how we can find that? Through an environmental assessment. I'm gonna give you a minute or two to take a look at this flow chart. This chart is gonna help. It's gonna help you to learn how to assess animal hazards in the field. I'm gonna give you 1 minute to take a look at it, and then I'm gonna come back and review it with you. This is a very important part of the webinar. Learn how to differentiate what it's a high hazard and what it's low hazard. Because as I say, we're gonna find animals in the field, but it's not the same finding one bird than having a bunch of birds in my field. Having one coyote than having like 10 coyotes. Take a look at that. Another thing that it's important that it's not because you find an animal in the field, that means that all the field is contaminated. No, we need to assess the risk. We need to take a look at the volume and concentration of fecal material in the field, the frequency of animal sightings and sign, tracks, roving, animals damage to the crop, animal species likely to aggregate and produce concentrated areas of fecal material and incidental contact with the crop. Potential for animals to transport pathogens from a high-risk source. Birds that may transport the pathogens. Even the season of the year. Do we have a migrating species? Like in Arizona, for instance, if you have a farm that is next to a date farm and the dates are on the ground, you're gonna have animals walking through your field because they want to eat those dates, and they are not gonna go around the farm, around the field. They are gonna go through the field. So you need to assess your farm. If you have neighbors, what are you gonna do? In some cases, if you have that the risk is really, really high and that you have several spots of fecal material, you might decide to do not harvest that field. Remember that the produce safety rule says that and I especially like that area of the produce safety rule. It says something like this, that if you if there's a likelihood that you have animal intrusion in your field, that you need to assess and look for contaminated product and do not harvest product that it's contaminated. It doesn't tell you how are you gonna do that. It tells you the what. And if you find product that it's not contaminated, you must not harvest that product. How can you do that assessment? How can you evaluate that field? Through an environmental assessment. What if you find fecal material in the field? Stop harvesting and follow your SOP immediately. And what some companies do, what some farms do all over the Americas, they determine a no harvest or buffer zone. This can be 3 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet, you name it. It depends on the amount of fecal material. It depends on the type of product. I've seen so many, like if you find, let me tell you a story of like on an orchard that the product grows on the trees. If they found a dog poop, they flag that area, they put like lime in that area, and then the supervisor instructs the harvesting crews to do not place product near that area. Of course, do not place product on the floor. Who's gonna be really important for this? Because we cannot walk the entire field. The workers. The workers need to be trained so they can identify the product that is visible contaminated and don't harvest that product. And they also need to be trained that when they find something, stop and call the supervisor. Because yes, the environmental assessment is really important, but remember, we are not gonna walk the entire field. The employees can help us to accomplish that, to do not harvest product that is visible contaminated. And that's also a product safety board requirement. If evidence of animal hazards in the production block are not discovered until harvest operation begins. Stop harvest operation. Initiate an intensified block assessment for evidence of further contamination and take appropriate action as outlined above. In other types of industries like spinach or industries that harvest with machines, there's a guy that his only job is to walk the field, and he's walking in front of the harvesting machine, and he's walking like this. You know what he's doing? He's looking for fecal contamination, for animal intrusion. So there are many different ways of doing things, so we can identify different risks. Let me see how are we doing on time. I have 10 more minutes. If any events of hazards are discovered during harvest and equipment or product is potentially contaminated, clean and sanitize the equipment before resuming harvesting operations. Require all employees to wash their hands, gloves before resuming harvesting operations. And if you discover that the fecal contamination is in your bins and totes, you need to clean and sanitize them. Also, we should be concerned about our fields, but we also need to take a look at adjacent land activity. What is going on around me? What is going on around me? What I can be taking care of my field, be taking care of my water, but what are my neighborhoods doing? Are they applying untreated manure in their fields? And then we have a road in between us, and then they stack or they pile the soil amendment or the manure next to my field. Hopefully not in a windy day. I've seen people who have a very sophisticated food safety program, and then they put the untreated manure next to a wellhead. And I'm not talking about leafy greens. I'm talking things that I've seen in other places. Am I next to a septic tank? Is it in good condition? Do I have runoffs? Do I have a dairy barn next to my field, and the dairy farm, it's like uphill? And then what happens if it rains? So I also need to take a look at the adjacent land activity. Am I next to the river? If I'm next to the river, I'm probably gonna have animal activity in one area of my field. Why is that? Because animals are gonna go to the river to drink water. Does my neighbor, pile the trash next to my field? And that becomes a Harvard sites for pests? All these little things are things that I need to take a look at. Livestock grazing on immediately adjacent land. As I say, who are my neighbors? Am I next to a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation? These distances change in the LGMA metrics. And then I also need to take a look at during my assessments, during the visual monitoring of the field and my farm, I need to take a look at the hand harvesting equipment. Are people allowed to take the knife to their houses? Do they put little things like, do they put duct tape on the knife? Do they go and really dip it in the chlorinated water? Do they clean and sanitize before entering the field? The harvesting machines, have they been cleaned and sanitized? Oh, there's the guy that I was like telling you, the guy who was walking. Containers, I also need to take a look at containers. Where do I store my containers? Is it an open field? Do I store my containers under the shade of a tree? Do I have birds on that tree? Are the containers clean? Workers also need to be trained that when they grab a container, that the container is clean. And if it's not clean, leaks and spills. If I use Harvesting machines. We already talked about fecal material. Blood. What is my policy when my workers cut themselves? Do they have cuts? If they have cuts, am I providing a Band-Aid? Of course, they need to wash their hands. But what happens if they cut? Do I have a procedure in place? How am I gonna find if there's if people have cuts? During the environmental assessment. And I'm not talking that look at each of the employees' hands. Glass. How am I gonna find if there's glass? look at what I'm just gonna say. There was one company that they used to find glass on Mondays on a couple of fields. Why was that? Because it was next to a road, and those were beer glass that people just like threw in the field when they were drinking. Chemical contaminants. How do I store them? Are they labeled? Do they have the labels? Trash and waste. Is the field free of trash? Do we clean the areas where people are going to have lunch? The designated break areas. So with all that say, I think I just covered many different of the give me 1 second. Many different of the potential contamination risks in a field. Some additional tips, some basic recommendations for doing a good job when assessing the fields. You might know your field really, really good. This might be your 12th season harvesting that field or growing in that field, and you have never had an issue. But you also need to go out and physically walk the field you are assessing. Not because you have been there for 12 years, that means that you can just check your environmental assessment. You need to go there, walk the field, and assess the different risks that we cover in this presentation. There might be more risks, but we only have 1 hour. And I try to condense, this is a 4-hour workshop that goes along with a video that you have. But we try to condense this into 1 hour. Don't be overconfident when doing your inspections. You must still carefully walk through all your fields, visually inspect them, and record everything. Be prepared, because there's a ranch may give you a surprise at any given time. Pay close attention to the process of filling out your forms. Teach your employees good documentation practices. Make them aware that they are generating the footprint of the field on a specific date. Also, it is important to tell people to don't fill records in advance, because that is falsification of records. Records must be filled at the moment of performing the activity. Do not cut corners or take shortcuts. Your foreman or supervisors are a key part of the team. You have to make sure that they also follow all the food safety procedures all the times. Without that say, I want to thank you. I want to thank the Colorado State University for having me. And I think we have time for field some questions. I have plenty of time. I'm not going anywhere. Any questions or comments? I was really fast. There's so much information that I wanted to cover that it's just not possible. But let me do a quick summary of what we covered. We covered what an environmental assessment is. It's a visual monitoring of your field, looking for physical, chemical, or biological hazards that may pose potential for produce contamination. And then we mentioned that there are three types of environmental assessments: the pre-planting, the pre-harvest, and the daily harvest. The pre-planting is before planting the field. The pre-harvest is the one that it's done within 1 week, which is very similar of the daily harvest. We also cover the checklist, what's on a checklist, 3 main things on a checklist: the general information about the field, the potential sources of contamination that you're gonna be looking at during your environmental assessment, and the different corrective actions. Then I went over the different potential contamination areas, gave you an overview, a quick overview. I tried to use plain English with an accent though. And then I close with mastering giving you some general tips on mastering an environmental assessment. With all that said, I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Sergio. It was a really great presentation. I do have a question for you while we're waiting to see if others have any in the chat box. So a lot of farmers tell me that they never see wildlife in their fields and they feel like it's not worth their time to do an environmental assessment of their growing areas. So what would you say to those farmers who feel like that fits them?
There's a lot of things that we don't see, but there are some things that we can see. My recommendation is take the time to walk the field. Trust, but verify. I'm not talking about walking 100 hectares. Just walk a little bit. Just walk a little bit, and that will help you to minimize the risk. Do a 5-minute walk. Train your supervisor, train your foreman to do a 5-minute walk. Right now, it's a requirement in the product safety rule. I can't recall from the top of my head, I think it says, if there's a likelihood for your, let me tell you what it says. If there's a likelihood that you have animal intrusion in your field, you must assess the field. It doesn't tell you, the product safety rule doesn't tell you to document it. It just tells you to inspect. Just take the time, take 5 minutes. Take 5 minutes to walk the field. I'm not saying that you're gonna walk the entire field.
That's a great suggestion. I also liked your suggestion of doing some kind of pattern, a Z pattern in the field. I haven't heard anybody describe it that way before, so that's a really great suggestion as well.
Another thing that you can do, like if you know that your risks are on this side of the field, but not really on this side of the field, focus on this area.
Yep, no, that makes sense. Martha, do you want to?
Well, we have a comment, yeah, in the chat box, Sergio. So this is about having observed a peach grower who allows dogs in the orchard. So that means there's dog feces on the ground of the orchard. So he doesn't think it is a hazard because the fruit is so high off the ground. The question is, would you agree? What would you tell this grower?
Oh boy. That's a question that I get everywhere. And I thought I was gonna get rid of that in this webinar and not. It keeps following me because I do a lot of work with mangoes, avocados, and okay, here's my take on this. You gotta look at your risks. The dog, let me look at the dog, and I'm not saying that this is not important. I'm gonna look at the dog from 2 different things, and I'm gonna give you a story of a mango grower. He just constructed a very nice well and technified his well. And he had a dog. Some third party, that he was like consultant, tell him to get rid of the dog. There was a house in that ranch. It was a big ranch, a big mango orchard. Okay, he got rid of the dog. And guess what happened next? This was in a Latin American country. We had some people stealing the copper and all the electrical like installation of his well because there was no dog. Obviously, that dog was a working animal, correct? That was a working animal, okay? And from a food safety perspective, the problem is not the dog. The problem is when you have people harvesting in that field and the dog is next to that people. And the people are playing with the dog and then they go and harvest the product. And the problem is when they have feces in the ground and then they put the product there. Does that make sense? Because at first the dog doesn't like mangoes or doesn't like avocados or whatever. The problem is when how you manage that dog. If you have your product here and then you have the dogs here and people interacting with the dog, that's a big issue. That's a big food safety risk. If you do an environmental assessment of your field and then you look for the feces of the dog and then you maybe mark them or flag them or remove them, like there are some ranches that they have 2 shovels, that they have 2 shovels for removing the feces. And then mark that area and then not having people putting the baskets with product on the floor. You are minimizing the risk. So that's the way I see things. How can that grower minimize risk? I'm not going to be answering that question in saying that that's correct and incorrect. I would have to look at the facility. Now, is it 1 feces or 2, or is infested and you haven't cleaned that place like in years? So you gotta do an assessment. You gotta look at the risk. Is the dog causing a food safety issue? The dog must go. See what I'm saying? See what I'm saying? And I'm giving that argument based on what the produce safety rule says. Is that a working animal? Is that a pet? Of course, the best thing is not having that dog there. See what I'm saying? And I would say that it might be a hazard to answer that. What would I tell that grower to answer more specifically? Because I like to talk a lot. Do a risk assessment. Look at the risk that dog brings to the farm. But it's not only just saying the peaches are here and the poop is down here. Do a risk. What mitigation risks do I have? Do I have people who step on the dog poop and then they are like on the ladders or on the trucks and look at all these little things. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, thank you, Sergio. That's complete, I think. Yeah. And we'll keep monitoring the chat if there's any follow-up on that issue. So thank you.
One thing that I want to say, I'm not minimizing the dog problem in that peach farm, correct? I'm just giving you different scenarios of what I've seen.
No, that's helpful. Another question for you, Sergio, is what about the person who goes out and does that field assessment? Do you think it should always be the same individual? Is it good to have several individuals and you rotate that responsibility? Could you talk about, where a grower has the opportunity to maybe rely on more than one person? Could you talk a little bit about the pluses and minuses of that strategy?
It depends on the farm. If you have all the hectares in the world, you may have a team of 10 people doing that. But if you're a small grower with, I talk hectares, I should have say acres. That's still all the acres in the world. If you have just a few acres and it's a mom and papa farm, well, you only might have like one person or like 2 of them like rotating. It's better to have different people doing that. But my recommendation is to have one very well trained if you're a small farmer, if you're a small grower, and if you're a large farm, you're probably gonna have to have a couple of people taking care of that.
Okay, thank you.
Remember another thing that is important. Growers need to grow. This is only one thing. But there's a catch with this. Food safety is non-negotiable. It's non-negotiable. So you should do all these things, no matter what, to make sure that your product is safe.
Great, thank you very much. Christy, I don't see any more questions. I don't know if you've received any others. Okay.
No, I don't have any.
Okay. I guess, Sergio, any last comments that you'd like to make?
My email is there. Feel free to shoot me an email, text me, whatever. If you have any questions, we will be more than happy to answer these questions. I'm just the face of the company, and I try to put a couple of practical examples here. It's difficult to condense this in a 1 hour webinar, but I did have fun teaching this. Thank you very much to the university for having me.
Yes, thank you very much, Sergio. It was great. We really appreciate you taking the time today to do this presentation for us. I think with that, we will go ahead and end the webinar. So thank you to everybody, all of our people who joined our webinar. I hope this was valuable and look for it posted on our website.
Would you say